What up, though? So your ancestors had shackles on their neck, wrists, and ankles? They had whips on their back like the kind your mama or grandmama put on yours with switches, hangers, belts, extension cords, plastic toy bats, multiplied by 100 though, right? Some vanilla cream colored people, light brown people, medium brown people, dark brown people, real dark brown people, pink people, light gray people, and orangish people came over here with nothing, didn't know your language, didn't know the environment, the flora and fauna, and they flourished without your help, and they subjugated you, or better yet, not you. Some people from one of those 50 plus countries on the southern part of the Afro-Eurasian landmass? Or some vanilla cream colored people, light brown people, medium dark brown people, dark brown people, real dark brown people, pink people, light gray people, and orangish people came over here where your family was, and they struggled hard, turned vicious, started removing some of the children, doing them dirty, traded the children for provisions and whatnot. Don't get me wrong. Not all of the foreigners came and caused problems. Think of today. There are people causing problems from coast to coast, and it's not affecting you and your family sitting down to eat dinner, right? These were isolated events. Think of today. There are people taking other people, women, children, disappearing them. The story of Pocahontas has been told wrong for years. Littlethings.com. Historians have gotten nearly every detail about Pocahontas wrong, including her name. Note, ignore these pictures, ignore these illustrations. You would be hard pressed to find any illustrations from the time period that we're talking about that haven't been, quote, whitewashed, unquote. Or you gonna pay a whole lot of scratch to get those original pictures, which I'm sure is in someone's home collection or some museum or in some archives in some air controlled environment underground or something like that. But historians have gotten nearly every detail about Pocahontas wrong, including her name, by Stephanie Kaloy. Of Matoka. Matoka's mother died at birth. Her father began calling her Pocahontas. Matoka met John Smith when she was 9 or 10. Matoka would have been only 9 or 10 when John Smith arrived at her home of Sinacomoka. John Smith was 27 years old. She never saved John Smith's life. Children in the Powhatan tribe were closely watched, and as Matoka was the daughter of the chief, she likely would have been even more protected. John Smith was captured by the chief's brother, Chief Wahan Seneca, even made John Smith Werowance, or leader of the colonists. Years after the fact, John Smith created the story that Matoka saved his life. There would be no risk to his life once he received this designation. Children were also not permitted to attend ceremonies, So it's unlikely Matoka would have been there in the first place. Think about it. How many times you was a shorty and you grown folks was talking and you tried to chime in and they told you to get the, you know what I'm saying, get your whatever away from here. This grown folks business. Matoka lived in Wero Wokomoko. As she was only 10, it's not likely that she would have traveled that far on her own. Getting to Jamestown would also require the use of a massively heavy canoe. The colonists were not known for being well behaved. They often targeted women and children in Wero Wokomoko. Children were sometimes violated, and many mothers began offering themselves to colonists in an effort to protect their children. Matoka was a teenager at the time and found herself facing a rite of passage common at her age: marriage. If you want to know about yesterday, think about today. Think about today. All this trafficking and all this other type of stuff. And then the people, the women, the children trafficked are usually used as servants, for lack of a better term. The colonists made Pocahontas leave her child, offed her husband, and forced her onto a boat. Pocahontas suffered from severe depression and anxiety following her kidnapping. The colonists eventually allowed her sister, Matachana, and her brother-in-law, Utamatamakin, to visit her. Historian Dr. Linwood Costello has written about what they learned. When Matachana and Utamatamakin arrived at Jamestown, Pocahontas confided in that she had been violated. Mattaponi sacred oral history is very clear on this. Pocahontas was violated. It is possible that it had been done to her by more than one person and repeatedly. My grandfather and other teachers of Mattaponi oral history said that Pocahontas was violated. The possibility of being taken captive was a danger to be aware of in Powhatan society, but violation was not tolerated. Violating a woman or girl in Powhatan society was virtually unheard of because the punishment for such actions was so severe. She, excuse me, she married John Rolfe. Married. She was required to convert to Christianity and take the name Rebecca. Some historians believe the two married for love. It is known that she was never able to see her son, father, or family again. John Rolfe's letter to Sir Edwin Sandys. Milestone documents in African American history. About the latter end of August, a Dutch man of war of the burden of 160 tons arrived at Point Comfort. The commander's name, Captain Jope, his pilot for the West Indies, one Mr. Marmaduke, an Englishman. They met with the treasure in the West Indies and determined to hold consortship hitherward, but in their passage lost one the other. He brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victuals, whereof he was in great need, as he pretended, at the best and easiest rate they could. He brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes. That was John Rolfe's letter to Sir Edwin Sandys. Noah Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language, 1828. Slave, noun, a person who is wholly subject to the will of another, one who has no will of his own, but whose person and services are wholly under the control of another. In the early state of the world, and to this day among some barbarous nations, prisoners of war are considered and treated as slaves. And to this day among some barbarous nations, prisoners of war are considered and treated as slaves. The slaves of modern times are more generally purchased like horses and oxen. Number 2, one who has lost the power of resistance. One who has lost the power of resistance, or one who surrenders himself to any power whatever, as a slave to passion, to lust, to ambition. As a slave to passion, to lust, to ambition. Number 3, a mean person, one in the lowest state of life. 4, a drudge, one who labors like a slave. Slave, verb, intransitive, to drudge, to toil, to labor as a slave. Keep in mind that when I went over the 1828 Noah Webster's American Dictionary of the English Languages online definition of the word black in my second show, a large portion of the definition had been omitted. So I'm not suggesting you believe or not believe. Ultimately, we weren't there. This is from Etymology Online, Origin and Meaning of Slave by Etym Online. Slave, noun, circa 1300. Sklav, esclave, person who is the chattel or property of another. From Old French, esclave, 13th century, and directly from medieval Latin, sclavus, slave, source also of Italian schiavo, French, esclave, Spanish, esclavo. Originally Slav, so used in this secondary sense because of the many Slavs sold into slavery by conquering peoples. The meaning, one who has lost the power of resistance to some habit or vice, is from 1550s, applied to devices from 1904, especially those which are controlled by others. Compare slave jib in sailing, Similarly, of locomotives, flashbulbs, amplifiers. In U.S. history, slave state, one in which domestic slavery prevails, is from 1812. Piao, piao, related to piawian, to serve, and prael, see thrall. The Slavic words for slave, Russian, rob, Serbo-Croatian, rob, Old Church Slavonic, rabu, are from Old Slavic, orbu, from the PIE root, orb, also source of orphan, the ground sense of which seems to be thing that changes allegiance. In the case of the slave, from self to master. The Slavic word is also the source of robot. The reduction of SCL to SL is normal in English. Compare slate, also Dutch slaaf, Danish slave, but German sklav. Slave, native tribe of northwestern Canada. 1789, from slave, noun, said to translate Cree, Algonquin. Awaken, captive, slave. Slave, verb, 1550s, to enslave, from slave, noun, the meaning, work like a slave, is attested by 1719, related, slaved, slaving. The history of slavery and the slave trade, ancient and modern. The African slave trade and the political history of slavery in the United States. Compiled from authentic materials by W.O. Blake, Black, Bleak, Bleached. Columbus, Ohio, 1860. Slavery in the colonies. Slavery was first introduced into the North American colonies in 1620 by a Dutch vessel which landed a portion of her human merchandise at Jamestown, Virginia. The event was almost simultaneous with the landing of the Pilgrims on Plymouth Rock, December 22nd, 1620. In buying and holding Negro slaves, the Virginians did not support themselves to be violating any law, human or divine. Whatever might the number of Negroes in the colony, limited as it was to a few cargoes, brought at intervals by Dutch traders, was long too small to make the matter appear of much moment, and more than 40 years elapsed before the colonists thought it necessary to strengthen the system of slavery by any express enactments. In the colony of Massachusetts, a body of fundamental laws was established in 1641. One of the articles, based on the Mosaic Code, provides that there shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, nor captivity among us, unless it be lawful captives, taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold unto us. And these shall have all the liberties and Christian usages which the law of God established in Israel requires. This exempts none from servitude who shall be judged thereto by authority. This article sanctions the slave trade and the holding of Negroes and Indians in bondage. This seems to be the first positive enactment in the colonies on the subject of slavery. A brief history of slavery that you didn't learn in school. The New York Times. The 1619 Project examines the legacy of slavery in America. It says, we've got to tell the unvarnished truth. The New York Times article says, we've got to tell the unvarnished truth. "400 years after enslaved Africans were first brought to Virginia, most Americans still don't know the full story of slavery." Curated by Mary Elliott, all text by Mary Elliott and Jasmine Hughes, August 19th, 2019. Sometime in 1619, a Portuguese slave ship, the São João Bautista, traveled across the Atlantic Ocean with a hull filled with human cargo. Captive Africans from Angola in southwestern Africa, men, women, and children, most likely from the kingdoms of Ndongo and Congo, endured the horrific journey bound for a life of enslavement in Mexico. Almost half the captives had died by the time the ship was seized by 2 English pirate ships. The remaining Africans were taken to Point Comfort, a port near Jamestown, the capital of the English colony of Virginia, which the Virginia Company of London had established 12 years earlier. The colonist James Rolfe wrote to Sir Edwin Sandys of the Virginia Company that in August 1619, a Dutch man of war arrived in the colony and brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes. 20 and odd Negroes. 20 and odd Negroes. The Africans were most likely put to work in the tobacco fields that had recently been established in the area. Africans and Europeans had been trading goods and people across the Mediterranean for centuries. Africans and Europeans had been trading goods and people across the Mediterranean for centuries. But enslavement had not been based on race. This is understandable considering in essence, these were all the same kind of people. Of course, different complexions, but the same nonetheless. I mean, in so much as being from the same landmass. Now, I can't say that I'm the same as a person from Canada, or I'm the same as a person from Mexico, or Central America, or South America, or the islands. But being that you can go from the top of Canada to the bottom of Argentina without crossing a body of water, it's the same as being able to go from the top of Europe to South Africa without crossing a body of water. One landmass. Africans and Europeans had been trading goods and people across the Mediterranean for centuries, but enslavement had not been based on race. Though people of African descent, free and enslaved, were present in North America as early as the 1500s, the sale of the 20 and odd African people set the course for what would become slavery in the United States. 20 and odd African people. I know I'm emphasizing these words, but I mean, look up here. That in August 1619, a Dutch man of war arrived in the colony and brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes. And here, were present in North America as early as the 1500s, the sale of 20 and odd African people. So now we move on to Dane Calloway. I'm just here to make you think website. In John Rolfe's journal, currently located in full at the National Archives facilities in London, he documented the round-trip shipments of tobacco, silver, and gold, and the famously known, quote, 20 and odd negras, which was changed by the Department of Historic Resources of Virginia 3 times, from 20 and odd negras to 20 and odd negros, to now officially read today as 20 and odd Africans, commencing in 1992. 20 and odd negras. In John Rolfe's journal, currently located in full at the National Archives facilities in London, he documented the round-trip shipments of the tobacco, silver, and gold, and the famously known, quote, 20 and odd negras. Jack D. Forbes, Africans and Native Americans, chapter Negro, Black, and More, page 69. Thus, the Jesuit father called the American women living with Portuguese men negras, a term which, according to Leet, could not have denoted people from Africa because in 1549 there were few or no African women in Bahia. Thus, the Jesuit father called the American women living with Portuguese men negras. In 1619, some 20 Negroes were brought to Virginia. The Jesuit father called the American women living with Portuguese men negras. In John Rolfe's journal, currently located in full at the National Archives facilities in London, he documented the round-trip shipments of the tobacco, silver, and gold, and the famously known, quote, 20 and odd negras. Women and girls. Slavery in America didn't start in Jamestown in 1619. Time.com. The first Africans in Virginia landed in 1619. The first Africans in Virginia landed in 1619. It was a turning point for slavery in American history, but not the beginning. By Olivia B. Waxman, August 20th, 2019. It was 400 years ago, about the latter end of August, that an English privateer ship reached Point Comfort on the Virginia Peninsula. There, Governor George Yeardley and his head of trade, Cape merchant Abraham Piercy, bought the 20 and odd Negroes aboard in exchange for victuals, meaning they traded food for slaves, food for Negroes, food for negras, food for women and girls. What began in 1619, the human cargo that arrived in Virginia in 1619 had come from the port city of Luanda, now the capital of present-day Angola. This is time.com. That ship was en route to the Spanish colony of Veracruz when two English privateer ships, the White Lion and the Treasurer, intercepted it and seized some of the Angolans on board. According to James Horn, president and chief officer of Jamestown Rediscovery, both ships were owned by a powerful English nobleman, the Earl of Warwick, Robert Rich. Rich was anti-Spanish and anti-Catholic and profited from thwarting Spanish shipping in the Caribbean. The White Lion, which flew under the flag of a Dutch port known for its pirates, came to Virginia first in late August 1619, followed 4 days later by the Treasurer. The most cited account of those events in 1619 is found in that letter to the Virginia Company of London, which had run the Jamestown settlement since its establishment in 1607, from John Rolfe, one of the early English settlers there, and most famously Pocahontas' husband. Historians do not know much about the men and women who were sold to Yeardley and Piercy. Historians do not know much about the negras, much about the Negroes, the Africans, the negras, the women and girls who were sold to Yeardley and Piercy, or what happened to them, though some of their names have been revealed. Indigenous people, notably those of the 30-odd tribal communities led by Pocahontas' father, Powhatan, lived in the area that became Virginia long before Europeans or Africans got there. The English settlers enslaved indigenous people around the time of 1619. It's hard to believe that all these different statements are within the same article, the same document. It's extremely telling. Pocahontas' father, Powhatan, Remember in my other show, Powhatan came with 100 or 200, I forget the number, as black as him. Indigenous people, notably those of the 30-odd tribal communities led by Pocahontas' father, Powhatan, lived in the area that became Virginia long before Europeans or Africans got there. The English settlers enslaved indigenous people around the time of 1619. The English settlers enslaved indigenous people around the time of 1619. Today, Fort Monroe stands where the White Lion landed. The proclamation by President Barack Obama in 2011 that made the fort a national monument reads, "The first enslaved Africans in England's colonies in America were brought to this peninsula on a ship flying the Dutch flag in 1619, beginning a long ignoble period of slavery in the colonies and, later, this nation." That proclamation validated research by Calvin Pearson, who runs a local history effort called Project 1619. The proclamation by President Barack Obama in 2011 that made the fort a national monument reads, "The first enslaved Africans." America's history of slavery began long before Jamestown. History.com. America's history of slavery began long before Jamestown. The arrival of the first captive to the Jamestown colony in 1619 is often seen as the beginning of slavery in America, but enslaved Africans arrived in North America as early as the 1500s. Crystal Ponte, updated August 26, 2019, original August 14, 2019, History.com. In late August 1619, the White Lion, an English privateer commanded by John Jope, sailed into Point Comfort and dropped anchor in the James River. Virginia colonist John Rolfe documented the arrival of the ship and 20 and odd Africans on board. His journal entry is immortalized in textbooks, with 1619 often used as a reference point for teaching the origins of slavery in America. It is believed the first Africans brought to the colony of Virginia 400 years ago this month were Kimbundu-speaking peoples from the Kingdom of Ndongo, located in the part of present-day Angola. The ship embarked with about 350 Africans on board, but hunger and disease took a swift toll. En route, about 150 captives perished. The arrival of these 20 and odd Africans to England's mainland American colonies in 1619 is now a focal point in history curricula. The date and their story have become symbolic of slavery's roots. In the region that would become the United States, there were no enslaved Africans before the Spanish occupation of Florida in the early 16th century, according to Linda Haywood and John Thornton, professors at Boston University and co-authors of Central Africans, Atlantic Creoles, and the Foundation of the Americas, 1585 through 1660. From an Anglo-American perspective, 1619 is considered the beginning of slavery. From an Anglo-American perspective, 1619 is considered the beginning of slavery. Library of Congress. Immigration and relocation in U.S. history. Beginnings, exploration and colonization. Africans came to the New World in the earliest days of the Age of Exploration. In the early 1500s, Africans trekked across the many lands in North, Central, and South America that were claimed by Spain. In the early 1500s, Africans trekked across the many lands in North, Central, and South America that were claimed by Spain, some coming in freedom and some in slavery, working as soldiers, interpreters, or servants. Explorers of African descent joined the expeditions of Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, Ponce de Leon, Hernan Cortés, Hernando de Soto, and many more. And in 1619, a year before English pilgrims arrived at Plymouth, Massachusetts, a group of 20 and odd African people was brought to England's Jamestown colony in Virginia in captivity. The 1619 landing, Virginia's first Africans report. Hampton, Virginia official website. The 1619 landing, Virginia's first Africans. In late August 1619, 20 to 30 enslaved Africans landed at In late August 1619, 20 to 30 enslaved Africans landed at Point Comfort, today's Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia, aboard the English privateer ship White Lion in Virginia. Several days later, a second ship, Treasurer, arrived in Virginia with additional enslaved Africans. Both groups had been captured by English privateers from the Spanish slave ship San Juan Bautista. The landing of the first Africans in Virginia is one of the most significant events we interpret, and the transition from a handful of bound African laborers to a legalized system of full-blown chattel slavery took many decades. 1619 marks the beginning of race-based bondage that defined the African American experience. If for no other reason, it is important we have a conversation about what took place at Point Comfort in 1619 because it forever changed the course of the country. The legacy of this event affects us all, and understanding this complex history and legacy helps us to come together as Americans. Lucci Cochran, Executive Director, Hampton History Museum. 1619 First Africans Research Report. I wanted to say that this was an incredible job that all of you did with this document. It is light years ahead of what has been done so far. Cassandra L. Newby, Alexander, Ph.D., Professor of History, Dean, College of Liberal Arts, and Director, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, Center for African Diaspora Studies, Norfolk State University. African Americans at Jamestown. Historic Jamestown, part of Colonial National Historical Park, U.S. National Park Service. National Park Service. Historic Jamestown. African Americans at Jamestown. African Americans at Jamestown. Now, African Americans at Jamestown. The first documented arrival of Africans to the colony of Virginia was recorded by John Rolfe. About the latter end of August, a Dutch man of war of the burden of 160 tons arrived at Point Comfort. The commander's name, Captain Jope. His pilot for the West Indies, one Mr. Marmaduke, an Englishman. He brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victuals. The year was 1619, and as an institution, slavery did not yet exist in Virginia. 1619, arrival of 20 and odd Africans. The 20 and odd Africans were captives removed from the Portuguese slave ship San Juan Bautista, following an encounter the ship had with the White Lion and her consort, the Treasurer, another English ship, while attempting to deliver its African prisoners to Mexico. Rolfe's reporting the White Lion as a Dutch warship was a clear ruse to transfer blame away from the English for piracy of the slave ship to the Dutch. Thesaurus.com. Slave. Synonyms for slave. Laborer. Employee. Synonyms for employee. Laborer. Slave. Domestic. Worker. U.S. Law. Legal Information Institute. Employee. An employee is an individual who works under the supervision or control of an employer. A worker who is employed by an employer. An employee works in the service of the employer under an express or implied contract of hire that gives the employer the right to dictate the employee's work duties. That was from law.cornell.edu. The Noah Webster American Dictionary of the English Language, 1828, the online version. Employ verb, transitive. To occupy the time, attention, and labor of. To keep busy or at work. To use. Noah Webster, American Dictionary of the English Language, 1828, the online version. Laborer, noun, one who labors in a toilsome occupation, a man who does work that requires little skill, as distinguished from an artisan. Etymology, origin and meaning of laborer by Etym Etymology online, the etymology of words online version. Laborer, mid 14th century, manual worker, especially an unskilled one. Agent, noun from labor, meaning member of the working class. Member of the lowest social rank, is from circa 1400. Labor, late 14th century, perform manual or physical work, work hard, keep busy, take pains, strive, endeavor, also copulate. From Old French laborer, to work, toil, struggle, have difficulty, be busy, plow land. From Latin laborare, to work, endeavor, take pains, exert oneself, produce by toil, suffer, be afflicted, be in the distress or difficulty. From labor, toil, work, exertion. The verb in modern French, Spanish, and Portuguese means to plow, the wider sense being taken by the equivalent of the English travail. Sense of endure pain, suffer, is early 15th century, especially in phrase labor of child, meaning be burdened with trouble, affliction, etc., usually with under, is from the late 15th century. The transitive senses have tended to go with belabor, related, labored, laboring. To me, today is fair. It's fair. The whole go to school and get trained up to be an employee, a worker, laborer, slave for 30, 40 years, retire and die. Yeah, this system is fair. Go to school and get trained up to be an employee, worker, laborer, slave for 30, 40 years, retire and die. It's fair. Regardless what got us here, you now choose to fill out that contract. We choose to labor for someone else, be employees, slaves. Do the right thing.